Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to the Honorable Nancy Guthrie. She is a true Wyoming woman. She was born in Newcastle, Wyoming. She graduated from the University of Wyoming. She served on the 9th Judicial District Court in Sublette, Fremont, and Teton County. She is now retired and works as a mediator. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Emmy. Good morning.
Thanks for being here. I have to go back because I said you were born in Newcastle. But then you corrected me and told me you were actually born in South Dakota. So tell me that story.
Okay. I, of course, have just heard the story from my parents because it was the day I was born and I don't remember. But there were two doctors in Newcastle, Wyoming, where my parents were living. And one was fighting in World War II in the Pacific Theater. And the other was a fine doctor, I guess, but he was a drug addict. And he was on a bad trip the day I decided to be born. So my father hurriedly put my mother in the car and drove from Newcastle to the nearest hospital, which was Deadwood, South Dakota. So for the first week and a half or 2 weeks of my life, I actually lived in South Dakota. But I consider myself a Wyoming gal.
Tell us about your family and growing up in Wyoming.
Well, my family, I had mother and father, and then an older sister, who was the smart one of the family, and then I had a baby brother who was the genius of the family. And growing up in a little town, Newcastle, I think it had 3,000 or 4,000 people in it. It was really an idyllic childhood. We were just a few miles from Cambria, Wyoming, which was a deserted ghost town where immigrants had come from England and Scotland to work in the coal mines. And it was such a fun place. It was about 2 or 3 miles from Newcastle, and we would hike up there and play in the old deserted buildings and have a grand time. We didn't have television. We certainly, of course, didn't have iPhones or iPads. We played outdoors lots, and I was thinking about my childhood this morning on the way down here and thinking if there was one way to describe it, it was perfect. It was my sister and little brother and I were fortunate that we traveled quite a bit, considered quite a bit at that time. Now, living in Wyoming and people flying over to Switzerland and Paris and Argentina, we wouldn't have traveled much at all, but we went to the West Coast and traveled quite a bit around the United States. So we not only were exposed to different places and different people, but just had a good sense of what it was to live outside of Wyoming. And we all loved Wyoming and stayed in Wyoming. I left 2 or 3 times, but always kept coming back. So,
why did you decide to become a judge and go to law school? And do you think your dad influenced you and you followed in his footsteps?
Who really influenced me, Emmy, was my father as a young man was an attorney in Sundance, Wyoming. And he got an offer for a job in a law firm in Newcastle. And this was before my sister or I or my brother were born. But so he went to Newcastle to be in a law firm with a man by the name of Judge Raymond. Now, Judge Raymond was one of the first of the 7 district court judges in the state of Wyoming. And he, after a year, decided he didn't like being a judge. So he went to Newcastle, Wyoming, and opened up a law firm, but people still called him Judge. So my father went to work for Judge Raymond. Judge Raymond, when I was a little girl, 5 or 6, I thought he was very old. He was 75 or 80 and deaf and blind, but he adored my sister and me. And so we would go down to the office to visit our daddy, and Judge would be sitting in the law library, just sitting there, not reading because he was blind and couldn't hear anything, but we would sit up on his lap, and he would talk to us. And he would always ask Mary, what do you want to do when you grow up? And she said, well, Judge Raymond, I want to be a teacher or a nurse. And he would pat her on the head and say that was fine and give her a penny or a nickel. Well, I would jump up on his lap and he would say, well, now, Nancy, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a lawyer and a judge. And he gave me 25 cents. And it soon dawned on me that that was the only answer that you could give. I think Mary did start giving that answer, but it was too late by then. But maybe it was bribery. But I decided, Emmy, as a little girl, that I wanted to be a lawyer and not specifically a judge. But when I was in law school, all my law school friends and students, peers, all thought that the pinnacle of a legal education and legal profession was being a judge. I don't think young people feel that way today, but out of my class, I can't think of anyone. Oh, there were 2 or 3 that wanted to make lots of money, and one got disbarred, and the other did make lots of money. But like out of our class, I think there were 4 or 5 of us that reached what we considered the pinnacle of our profession, and that was being a judge. And one classmate, Mike Golden, was the Chief Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court. And so that was why I decided I wanted to be a judge.
And what did you love most about that?
About being a judge?
Uh-huh.
I was the boss. No. It was so interesting to see the law from the other side, rather from the in the courtroom, but from the bench rather than at a podium. And I especially enjoyed jury trials. Teton County, even the 9th Judicial District, because that's where I spent my time as being a judge, has I think, a very enviable bar associations, attorneys in all 3 of the counties, because they're competent, they're generally prepared, and just a fine bunch of attorneys that were in those 3 counties. And I did try cases in the other 22 counties. There are 22 counties, and to help other judges. But the Wyoming lawyers, I was always impressed, but they were just as good as, or so much better than, the hot shots who would come from Chicago or New York City or San Francisco. That it was a wonderful place. It's a wonderful state to be a judge in, and the 9th Judicial District was the best district.
So do you think the fact that has such a small population makes it more enjoyable? You know people all across the state, and you know your friends, and you just get to know everybody in Wyoming.
How true. And sometimes that can be attorneys probably think that could be a great disadvantage, because in larger places you can practice law for 30 or 40 years and never see the same old grouchy judge the same. Well, these poor attorneys up in Teton County had to see me, a gray-haired lady every day, and some of them would have preferred to have had a new judge every day, but too bad.
Too bad. What is there a difference between being a female judge and a male judge? Did you find there was any kind of struggle as a woman growing up in Wyoming?
I didn't, Emmy. And what's so funny, looking back on it, well, first of all, with the judgeship, I don't think that they treated me any differently than they did Judge Kale. Judge Kale was the judge from Lander. She lived in Lander, but she was also the judge of the 9th Judicial District. And when she retired, I was appointed. And they were used to her, and so they were used to a woman. So I don't think any of the attorneys in the state of Wyoming felt maybe behind my back they told jokes and whatever, and they also would tell me how nice I looked and whatever. I'm certain they would never tell the male judges how nice they looked. Well, they didn't know how nice I looked. I had a black robe on, so they didn't have any idea what I was wearing, or my hair was combed. But so in answer to your question, no, I don't think I was treated any differently as a woman judge, and I used to think I wasn't treated any differently as a woman attorney. But looking back on it, when I was told by the dean of the University of Wyoming Law School that he really didn't want to admit me because I was taking up space that a man could take up, I had to smile. A couple nights ago when I saw the the fiction movie on the basis of sex about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And supposedly Dean Griswold, who was a famous, a criminal law or contracts professor. But anyway, when he told Ruth Bader Ginsburg asked if she realized she was taking a place that a man could take. And I smiled to myself and poked the woman next to me, who was also a lawyer, and we both smiled at each other because the woman, my friend, had gone to Georgetown Law School, and she had been told the exact same thing as Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been told and as Nancy Guthrie was told. And then my father gave me some advice, thinking he would discourage me from law school, which he didn't. He said, Nancy, he said, first of all, number one, you'll have to be twice as good as all the men in your class, but that won't be hard. Number two, if you get a law degree and try to get a job, no matter who you're hired or what law firm, if you go into a law firm you work for, you will have to make the coffee, do the typing, and the filing. And he said, but third, the worst thing is that you will fall in love with a law student, and you will marry him, and I can't imagine anything worse than being a lawyer. Just ask your mother. Or than being married to a lawyer. And sure enough, I fell in love with a law student and married him and practiced law for years with him. But yes.
Was that hard?
Yes.
What are some of your favorite growing up in Wyoming stories that you remember?
Oh, my.
I know you probably have so many.
Well, now my mind is almost blank. One of the fun growing up stories is, and it's a general story, is that every spring we would go to out to the Smith Ranch and help brand cattle, and that was always just great fun. And sometimes brand the sheep, and all the mothers would be busy in the kitchen fixing the wonderful food, smoking and drinking martinis probably. And the men would be out branding, drinking beer, and we would the little kids would just be running in the haystacks and playing in the corrals and riding horses, even though I didn't ride horses because I was frightened to death of them. I've never been fond of horses. So maybe I'm not a true Wyoming woman. And I remember those branding times and just lots of family times with young families and kids my age and just generally before the end of this little podcast I will think of some of the stories I wouldn't dare tell even today what we did. But some of the things we did were harmless fun. One time, two friends and I went over to Wind Cave it was, outside of Sturgis, South Dakota, between Sturgis and Custer. And it was well known for its bats. Of course, it was full of bats. We were in statute of limitations has run, so I can't get in trouble for this, but we entered federal property without permission. We were juniors in high school. We had great big canvas bags, and we filled them full of bats. They were hanging from the ceiling, and we were scooping down the bats and had hundreds of bats in these gunny sacks. I don't know why I should.
And what were you going to do with them?
Well, it was around October, and we went to the Dogie Theater in Newcastle, Wyoming, one night, and we let the bats go during a Halloween movie. Bobby and Daryl and I wouldn't have probably been discovered if we hadn't been everybody went running out of the theater shrieking, and we were sitting in the first or second row or whatever, laughing our heads off. And Mr. Ross, goodness gracious, he was the owner and manager of the theater, and he kicked us out of the theater for that year. That's not but that was and it was a childless, it was a prank. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was bit by a rabid bat. We did that one time with grasshoppers too, but we never got caught. Just harmless. One of the things too, of course, it was, and Beckett, my son, had this same thing happened to him when he was growing up. He couldn't have believed that everybody knew who he was. He was the son of two attorneys there in Little Basin, Wyoming. But I remember I couldn't believe that everybody in Newcastle would know who I was. And a couple times I got picked up for speeding or something, and the policeman said, "I'm going to tell your father." And I thought to myself, you don't even know who my father is. Of course they knew who my father was. He was the judge. He was a district court judge there in Newcastle from the time I was about in the 5th grade until I left home. So
I think it would be, you must have been going pretty fast to get a speeding ticket in Newcastle, Wyoming. I mean, those are all very backcountry dirt roads, Nancy. What were you doing?
The policeman, like in so many small towns, didn't have anything else to do.
So he had to pull you over.
Yeah.
That is really funny.
Quota for the week.
What do you think about what makes Wyoming so unique from other places you've been?
Well, I think you hit on it when you said it's so small, and everyone knows. It seems like everyone knows everybody else, or everybody else's parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles, and so many of the young kids stay in Wyoming, or if they leave Wyoming, they come back. I went to school when I went down to Laramie at the University of Wyoming. Our class was probably only 2,000 or 1,500 freshmen probably that year, and I probably knew 80% of them because of debate and because of various sports events and because of music, and that makes it unique. Also, the beauty of Wyoming is so unique, and especially where we live, Emmy, the Tetons, but then we have the Red Desert, we have the Black Hills. We're just we're rich in natural resources and environment, and rich in people. We have some very famous people or outstanding people who've come from Wyoming, and it's just a nice place to live. And you agree with that, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have a message for young women that you can pass on, some wisdom of what you've learned in your life, and kind of maybe some conclusions that you feel that people should think about as they're growing up?
Well, to all you young women, and I hope that your parents are as supportive of you as mine were, that I was born and raised to believe that it made no difference that I was a little girl, that I could do whatever I set my heart to do, and also to find something I loved and to try to make a living doing it. And I say stay the course. Don't let anyone get you down. Young women today have it, I think you have it easier, but not that much easier. But I just heard today on the radio that there are 100 women, who would have thunk it, in the United States House of Representatives out of the 428 or whatever there are. And but when I was growing up, I probably could have counted on both hands the number of women who were in the United States House of Representatives. So, and you have many more opportunities. And if you ever have a dean of a law school or somebody tell you that you're taking up space that a man could take up, you just smile at him and threaten him that you'll sue him if he doesn't let you into law school. No, not really. But of course now a professor would get, or professor employer would get in much trouble if he or she would tell you that, you were doing a man's job. Heavens, there are women over in Gillette, Wyoming who were driving those great, huge shovels, in the coal mines, and they're women truck drivers. And
right. There's lots of women.
And they're male male nurses, and women doctors. Women doctors were unheard of, as were women attorneys. I think 125 or 130 years ago, was her name Bradwell? She was from Iowa. She had a law degree, and she wanted to practice law, and the Iowa Supreme Court and then the United States Supreme Court said that she could not. So 125 or 30 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. And that 130 years ago isn't that long ago.
No, it's not.
But and today, it's the 150th year because it was 1869 that Wyoming gave the women the right to vote.
That's
and
right.
So, and you think about it, and in the history, that's not that long ago.
Right. Right.
And so my message to those wonderful little girls, or to anybody, is just to, if you have a passion, and find a passion, number one, and do it, stick to it, and don't be deterred by the fact that, of your color or your race or even your age. So go to it.
Thank you, Nancy. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Okay, thank you, Emmy.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.